Welcome, welcome, welcome! So happy to have you 2 minutes before midnight where I am. Woo! Which means I have to be a little bit more quiet than usual. But that's okay. We're getting down into some mysteries now. How are you all liking the story so far? Did you get caught up on chapter 3? Hi! Oh, you gotta watch chapter 3! You're not gonna know what's happening if you don't watch chapter 3. Book is best enjoyed from beginning to end. Oh, right. And once again, the headphones are off. If I can manage to put the book down without dropping it. Yeah. Music's all good. And that was a question in case anybody was wondering. Oh no, the picture. I forgot to change it. I'm sorry. There we go. You don't hear the music? Oh, okay. That was slightly concerning. Yeah, this is the same song we've been playing for the past few minutes. Well, for the past few chapters. Sorry. And we will be continuing to listen to it until we actually get into the more exciting things. Anyway, enjoy. I hope you enjoy the story. If you're in bed, please close your eyes, because this is what this channel is sort of about when you're not in the game section. The Stone Child by Dan Pawlowski. Chapter 4. After breakfast the next morning, Eddie begged his parents to let him explore the town. They agreed, but only after he had organized his closet, bureau, and desk. They also made him promise to be home for lunch. Less than an hour later, he was out the door. It was warm now that the sun had finally come out from behind the clouds. He didn't even need his hooded sweatshirt. Inside his backpack, he carried 2 Olmsted books that weren't still packed away, as well as the enigmatic manuscript. Standing next to his bike in the middle of his house's gravel driveway, Eddie had a perfect view of the town. The roads were laid out in concentric circles, linked by lanes and small side streets like a labyrinth. Long, thin park divided the town in half. On the western end of the park, at the base of the surrounding hills, sat an old wooden church, on the east, along the Black Ribbon River, huddled several mills. He wished he had been able to find the rest of his books the night before. He thought they might act as a map for his journey, even though he could probably list certain places for which he should keep a lookout, like the ones Sam had mentioned yesterday. Eddie figured there must be hundreds of secret Gatesweed spots he'd never on his own think to look for. Then again, Eddie knew he had all the time in the world to explore Gatesweed. Right now, however, he had a mystery to solve. The library had to be down there somewhere. Heights Road wound down to the town center. Eddie's bike kicked up clouds of dust. Before he realized what he was doing, he sped by several empty houses, a few deserted storefronts, and a brick fortress-like town hall. He braked in front of the park, where the long grass rustled in the warm breeze. He was on Center Street, True to its name, it circled the center of the park and came back to the spot where Eddie stood. Eddie glanced behind him, where an old movie theater sat quietly quietly, the front of it blockaded haphazardly by a loose chain-link fence. When Eddie noticed the marquee... Okay, I don't know how to pronounce that word. We're just gonna go with it. Marquee over the entrance of the building, basically the sign that holds the words for whatever's playing at the moment. Over the entrance of the building, his skin went cold. He expected to see an old movie title hanging on the yellowed white panel, but instead, broken black letters spelled out strange words that reminded Eddie of the code from the enigmatic manuscript. We should have a enigmatic manuscript count. If anybody wants to keep track of that, do start. Lo ed an ul fu hern no I ice. He stared at the theater. Eddie realized he was wrong. The words were not part of any code. Some of their letters were missing. Feeling like a contestant on a weird game show, Eddie slowly filled in the gaps. Closed until further notice. The sign had fallen apart over time. Eddie suddenly felt entirely alone. The town seemed to be deserted. Across the park stood a wide brick building covered in ivy. Stone steps led up to a high arch, over which was carved Gatesweed Public Library. Near the roof, around the top of the cornice, more words decorated the building. A place where stories are told. Eddie beamed. Eddie had never had tons of friends. In Heaverhill, the kids didn't understand stuff like studying astrological star signs, or reading about old Babylonian statues, or researching ancient Aztec gods at the library. People in Heaverhill tended to ignore the way things could be or might have been, and so they tended to ignore Eddie. His mom was always trying to get him to talk to people. Once, she'd sign him up for baseball and soccer and karate, but Eddie only learned that he wasn't very good at hitting or kicking. Plus, there was never very much talking involved. So Eddie had found friends in books. Nathaniel Olmsted's stories were so vivid and strange, it was as if they were being plucked directly from Eddie's own brain. Maybe here, he thought, people would understand what that felt like. He locked his bike to the stand and made his way up the stairs. When he pulled hard on the heavy glass door, the scent of old books wafted out. Eddie took a deep breath and stepped inside. In the center of the main room, 2 shallow balconies stretched from wall to wall, fenced in by intricate wrought iron railings. Tall shelves lined up vertically like teeth, running along the entire length of each floor. The books were a sight to behold. Their spines were a jumbled mishmash of different sizes and colors. Some were new, but most were dusty, musty, and worn. Spiral staircases wound their way up through each floor. Though much of the room was cast in shadow, a skylight allowed the sun to spill down the main level where Eddie stood. He gaped up at the beauty of the place and didn't realize his mouth was open until he heard a voice ask, "Can I help you?" The librarian sat behind a large wooden desk. A nameplate on top of the desk said, "Mrs. Singh. Sorry about that, Mrs. Singh. Associate librarian. Her hair was wavy and dark, and her happy face was round. She smiled at Eddie, so he smiled back. Sometimes book people were easier to talk to. "Hi," he said. "I'm looking for a book about solving puzzles." "Crossword puzzles?" she asked. "No, puzzles written in code." "What kind of code?" Eddie thought about that. "Like this?" he said, reaching into his bag and pulling out the book his mother had found the night before. He opened it to the middle and handed the book to her. The librarian flipped through the pages. When she happened upon the first page, she glanced at him, squinting with what looked like concern. "Where did you get this?" Mrs. Singh said Mrs. Singh quietly. "My mom gave it to me," said Eddie, suddenly unsure of himself. "Do you know what it means?" The librarian's face turned red. "Of course I don't know what it means," she said too forcefully. "Why would I know what it means?" "I just thought," he said. He cleared his throat, trying to compose himself. Maybe it wasn't so easy to talk to book people after all. "Can you recommend a book that might help?" "No, actually," she said suddenly. "I'm quite busy, and the library closes at noon today." She turned her back on him and started typing something at the computer on the table behind her. Eddie's face burned. Her attitude toward him had changed when she saw the first page. He wondered if the symbol written there had upset her, or had it been Nathaniel Olmsted's name that sparked her irritation. Eddie decided not to ask. Instead, he quietly made his way to a cluster of computers near the back spiral staircase. Pulling up the library's online catalog, Eddie suddenly had an idea. Since his own Nathaniel Olmsted books were packed away, it might be worth checking out a few from here, just to acquaint or reacquaint himself with some of the town's locations. When he typed the author's name, a message appeared. "We did not find results for Nathaniel Olmsted." Confused, Eddie checked his spelling and entered the name again, but he received the same message. No results? How could that be? He glanced at the librarian at the front desk. She was watching him. When she saw him looking at her, she flinched and turned back to her computer. Eddie shivered. The library must not be a fan of Nathaniel Olmsted. Eddie understood that some people didn't think Olmsted's books were very good, but they weren't considered literature. Still, it seemed odd that the man's hometown library wouldn't carry his own books, even if there was supposed to be an Olmsted curse. The tow truck driver's words echoed in Eddie's head. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath. "Don't be silly," he told himself. "It's only a story, right?" After searching the catalog for books about codes, Eddie climbed the stairs to the second floor and wandered into a row of shelves hidden in shadow. Even in the dim light, he managed to find the history of cryptography. Sometimes it's really hard for words to work in my head and in my mouth. At least this should get me started, he thought. Eddie headed back downstairs and reluctantly approached the front desk, where Mrs. Singh pretended to ignore him. After a few seconds, he said, "I'd like to check out this book, please." Finally, she turned around with a huff and a sigh. "Your library card," she said, holding out her hand to him. She waved her fingers impatiently. "I don't have one." Said Mrs. Singh. Eddie almost expected her to tell him that they were not issuing any new cards, but she reached under her desk, pulled out a piece of paper and a pencil, and handed them to him. Without looking at him, she said, "Fill this out." And he wrote down his new address and phone number and handed the paper back to Mrs. Singh. Which doesn't make sense because he literally just moved there yesterday. So how would he know the address? But it's plot armor, so it's fine. Eddie wrote down his new address and phone number and handed the paper back to Mrs. Singh. "You're new in town?" she said curiously. Eddie merely nodded. As she turned around, she began to chew on her lip. While he waited for her to process his new card, he flipped through the heavy book. It was filled with all sorts of confusing language, almost as weird as that of the enigmatic manuscript. Strange words like cipher, algorithm, skytail, skipjack, and cryptanalysis jumped off the page. There was so much stuff shoved between the covers. He wasn't even sure if he would be able to understand everything. "Here you go," said Mrs. Singh. She handed him a small peach-colored paper card on which was printed Gatesweed Public Library, a place where stories are told. "Thank you," he said as politely as possible. Eddie shoved the book in his bag, hiked it onto his shoulders, and struggled to open the library door. Once outside, Eddie could not deny that it was a lovely day. Puffy clouds hovered over the hills, and a warm breeze skirted around the corner of the library. When Eddie unlocked his bike, he decided to ride over to the park and flip through his new library book. He crossed Center Street and followed the path through the middle of the town green. Like the rest of the town, the park was strangely deserted. There were several benches planted randomly in the grass. Eddie hopped off his bike and was about to find a place to sit when he heard an odd whispering sound from across the lawn. The sound came from the direction of a bronze bust perched on top of a rectangular marble pedestal. The gray slab stood in the center of an old granite circle. Dandelions filled wide spaces where the slate had cracked over time. A plaque was attached to the front of the pedestal, but from where he stood, Eddie couldn't read what it said. He rested his bike on the sidewalk and trampled across the tall grass. When he got closer, Eddie could see that the face of the bust had been destroyed, as if by a large, blunt instrument. The nose had been smashed flat. Where its eyes should have been were two dark holes. Its lips were mangled into a permanent gaping howl. When he got closer, the whispering sound grew louder. Whist, 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 whist. It almost seemed as though the head was trying to speak to him through its distorted mouth. Eddie's hands went numb. He clutched the straps of his book bag against his shoulders. The pungent smell of bleach filled the air. How strange, he thought. Then, from the edge of the stone circle, he realized he could finally read the plaque. Dexter August, 1717 to 1779. Sam had mentioned this place. Eddie had actually found one of Olmsted's inspirations. Nathaniel Olmsted had written about the bust of Dexter August in The Ghost in the Poet's Mansion. It wasn't quite how Eddie had pictured it when he'd read the book. In Nathaniel Olmsted's version, Mr. August's face had not been vandalized. The sound of something splashing came from the other side of the statue, startling Eddie. He stumbled off the edge of the granite circle. A second later, he noticed a face peering at him from around the marble base. Before he could see it clearly, the face disappeared and the whispering sound began again. "Hello?" he said, trying to keep his voice from shaking. Keeping his distance from the bust, Eddie made his way to the other side. A skinny man dressed in a wrinkly blue uniform knelt in the center of the granite circle. He scrubbed at the marble pedestal with a heavy wood brush. Whist, 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 whist. Beside him sat a squat red metal bucket. After a moment, Eddie realized the man was the same police officer who had abandoned his family on Black Ribbon Road yesterday. Eddie could hear the man muttering when he noticed what the police officer was scrubbing at. Someone had sprayed black paint in a primitive shape of a face onto the back of the pedestal. Two black squiggles for eyes dripping down the stone where the paint had been sprayed on thick. Below the eyes, one almost straight line grinned grimly. On the ground behind where the police officer knelt, Eddie noticed more graffiti. Huge words painted directly onto the broken granite. "The woman is watching." Eddie hiked his bag higher onto his shoulder. "The woman is watching? What woman? Who is she watching?" He glanced at the library, where the glass doors stared at him darkly. He wondered if Mrs. Singh was watching him from behind her desk. Finally, the man looked at him, holding up his hand to block the sun's glare. He scowled. "It's not coming off this time." This time? Had someone done this before? Eddie wondered. "I'm sorry," he said, feeling for some reason as if the officer blamed him. "Oh, it's you," said the man, suddenly recognizing him. Eddie expected him to finish with, "You made it home all right," or "Sorry I couldn't be of more help yesterday," or at the very least, "You lived." But the man simply stared at him expectantly, as if he anticipated Eddie to sprout wings and fly away. The man's silence made him feel weird. I'll let you get back to work," Eddie said, stepping into the grass, heading toward his bike. The police officer continued to stare at him as he walked away. Eventually, the whispering sound began again as the man went back to scrubbing at the black paint. Whist, whist, whist. Eddie began to run. When he reached the sidewalk where his bike lay, he noticed something painted onto the window of a store on the other side of the park. Books. This time, the paint was not graffiti. Even though he was sort of freaked out, Eddie couldn't resist. His mother had mentioned a bookstore in Gatesweed. This must be it. A bookstore was always cozier than a library, more comforting. A familiar place in an unfamiliar town. He picked up his bike from the sidewalk, keeping far away from the weird cop. He walked his bike across the grass and across the street. The bookstore was in the lower portion of a 2-story white wooden house, the last in the row of buildings that curved along the park. A green and white striped awning reached out toward Eddie, shading the house's porch from the sunlight. Glancing over his shoulder toward the park, Eddie noticed the cop staring but decided to ignore him. He crept up the stairs and pressed his nose to the window of the store, holding up his hands to block out the glare. Dim lights hung from the ceiling, and bookshelves stretched up so high that tall ladders leaned against them in several spots. The store looked empty. "We're not open," said a voice behind him. Eddie spun around to see a blonde-haired boy who'd spent too much of the summer exposed to the sun. The skin on the boy's nose was peeling. Eddie thought he smelled like insect repellent. Eddie stood there with his mouth open, barely able to breathe. Why was it that he could approach an adult librarian without a problem, but when facing the possibility of conversation with someone his own age, Eddie's brain shut tight. "What do you want?" said the boy. Said Eddie, turning sunburnt red. He'd meant to say nothing, but was only able to spit out the first part of the word. The boy examined Eddie quizzically, before reaching around and opening the door. Cool air breezed out. Eddie was about to ask what time he should come back when the boy brushed past Eddie, closed the door, and locked it. Embarrassed, Eddie almost turned to leave when the window display caught his attention. He came closer to the glass to make sure his eyes weren't fooling him. Sitting on the table near the window ledge was a small display of Nathaniel Olmsted's books. A hand-painted sign propped up on the table read, Gatesweed's very own. The books were stacked precisely in several piles. The Ghost in the Poet's Mansion, The Revenge of the Nightmares, The Cat, the Quill, and the Candle, The Wrath of the Wendigo. They were all there. However, these were not the books that caught Eddie's attention. On the far edge of the table sat a small stack of leather-bound books that had a different title than the enigmatic manuscript. Eddie dropped his book bag onto the porch, bending over. He opened the book bag's front pocket and pulled out the book his mother had found the night before. Holding it up, Eddie compared it to the books sitting on the table. They seemed to be exactly the same. Would the inside of the books be the same too? Eddie felt his heart pumping. He could see the blond boy moving around near the back of the store. Eddie took a deep breath, realizing what he must do. The characters in Nathaniel Olmsted's books never solved any of their mysteries without taking a risk or two. Before he could think to stop himself, Eddie knocked on the window. When the blond boy peered around the corner of a bookshelf, Eddie waved and forced himself to smile. "We're closed!" shouted the boy before ducking away. His words hit Eddie in the chest like a fast, hard baseball. This wasn't going to be easy. Maybe he should leave. But no, he told himself. Ronald Plimpton would not have given up so easily. He raised his hand again and continued to knock. He didn't stop until the blond boy had come all the way to the front of the store. Angrily, the boy shouted through the door, "What is wrong with you?" I wanted to ask you something," Eddie stammered. Yeah? Yeah, said the boy, looking as if he were about to walk away. His voice sounded muffled through the glass. I wanted to know about that book on the table in the window, the enigmatic manuscript. What about it? I was wondering if you knew when Nathaniel Olmsted wrote it. The boy made a face like Eddie was crazy. Wrote it? Yeah, said Eddie. What year did the book come out? Nathaniel Olmsted didn't write a book called the Enigmatic Manuscript. Nobody wrote the Enigmatic Manuscript. Eddie shook his head, confused. The blond boy rolled his eyes, grabbed one of the books off the pile of enigmatic manuscripts, and opened it to a page in the middle. He held the book up to the window for Eddie to see. Blank, said the boy. Eddie still didn't understand. The enigmatic manuscript is the name of my mother's store, said the boy. The name of your mother's store? Said Eddie. He looked over his shoulder. The store's hanging placard sign stuck out from the pole at the top of the stairs, but it hung perpendicular to the street, so it was really only visible from either side of the stairs. We sell souvenir blank notebooks, the boy continued. If you want to buy one... The boy spun around and stared back toward the bookshelves. Over his shoulder he called, Then come back some other time. Wait! Cried Eddie, knocking on the window. When the boy turned around, Eddie quickly pressed the cover of his own copy of the book up to the window. I don't want to buy one, he called through the glass. I've already got one, and I think it might have belonged to Nathaniel Olmsted. Nathaniel Olmsted. The boy paused for a few moments before returning to the front of the store again. He unlocked the door and opened it and stood in the doorway. Why do you think that? He asked. Suddenly, Eddie felt foolish. Because mine's not blank. He awkwardly held out the book. The boy took it from Eddie and brushed the cover with his fingers. It was obviously older than the ones in the store. He turned it over and examined the spine. When he opened the cover and saw the first page, his eyes widened. A moment later, he squinted skeptically. Where did you get this? His reaction reminded Eddie of the librarian's. My parents bought it at an antiques fair just north of here, said Eddie. But look! He reached forward to turn the page. Whoa, said the boy, examining the strange words. What is this? That's what I'm trying to figure out, said Eddie. In his books, Nathaniel Olmsted always uses codes and stuff. Looks like he went a little bit overboard with this one. Right, I know. I've got all the books upstairs in my bedroom. You do? Eddie was surprised. He had begun to think no one in Gatesweed appreciated Nathaniel Olmsted like he did. Maybe you can tell me how Nathaniel Olmsted ended up with a souvenir book from your mom's store? Duh. Nathaniel Olmsted lived in Gatesweed. My mom knew him. Eddie was speechless. Forgetting the mystery for the moment, he wondered if Nathaniel Olmsted might have stood in this very spot. A long time ago, my mom told me Nathaniel Olmsted was the one who suggested she open the store. Even came up with the name. That's so cool. Did you know him? No way, said the boy. I was like 0 years old when he disappeared. 13 years ago, on Halloween. He was supposed to give a reading at my mom's store, but he never showed up. She tried calling him for the next few weeks, but she's never heard from him again. No one has. Okay. Huh, said Eddie. That's so weird. Then he had an idea. Hey, what do you know about the Olmsted curse? The boy gave him a sharp look. He pressed his lips together, then glanced over Eddie's shoulder toward the park. When Eddie turned around, he saw the police officer near the bronze bust glaring at them. I gotta go, said the boy suddenly. But I'm sorry, I'm not supposed to. The boy shoved the book into Eddie's hands. He turned around and closed the door to the bookstore, leaving Eddie alone on the porch. Across the street, the police officer tossed his brush into the bucket with a splash. Eddie decided to ride his bike back home. After hearing Sam mention the possibility of an Olmsted curse yesterday, he had expected that he might encounter some weird things in Gatesweed. After all, Olmsted's stories were pretty weird, so it made sense that the place where he wrote them might be weird too. But after his experience that morning, he thought he could use a break from weird for a few hours. Besides, the cryptology book was too heavy to simply carry around while he searched for more sites from Olmsted's books. When he opened his bedroom door, Eddie found his mother sitting on his bed, facing the window with her back to him. Mom, Eddie said. She yelped, leapt off his bed, and spun around. When she saw it was Eddie, relief flooded her face. Edgar, you scared me so badly I nearly flew out the window. What are you doing? Eddie asked, curious. When he noticed that she was holding in her hand his copy of The Wrath of the Wendigo. She held up the book and said, Guilty as charged. I was flipping through your book. I'm sorry I barged in here, but when I was unpacking this morning, I found a box that belongs to you. The small cardboard box sat at the end of his bed. Since you were looking for these books last night, I brought them up. Thanks, said Eddie. Can I borrow this one? She said, blushing. I know it's creepy fantasy stuff, which isn't usually my thing. She hesitated. Sort of silly, but... She flipped open the back cover and showed Eddie the picture of Nathaniel Olmsted. I had a feeling that I should look him up. I thought maybe since we live in his old town now, he could help me. She paused, then said, It's been so difficult lately, I'm not even sure I should be a writer anymore. Of course you should be a writer, said Eddie. You love writing. But I'm beginning to think I'm not any good, said Mom. I read you that epic poem I wrote last week. It was ridiculous. She threw her arms wide and said in a deep, dramatic voice, How woebegone was Constance Mead. She had one glass eye and couldn't read. What was I thinking? I don't even know what I want to write anymore. Forget this rhyming stuff. I've got to find a great story to tell. Eddie walked across the room to his bed, sat down on his mattress, and took off his sneakers. New town, new stories. Isn't that what Dad said? He did say that, didn't he? The funny thing is, I think I might actually have an idea for a news story, said Mom. Thank you for letting me borrow this. She waved the book. Let's hope this Nathaniel Olmsted person knows what he's doing. He knows, Eddie said. I'm sure of it. Mom went back downstairs. After unpacking some more boxes, Eddie spent some time hunched over his desk, scanning the mysterious book, searching for a clue. After staring at the page, the letters all started to blend together, and he couldn't concentrate. To clear his head, Eddie hauled the library book out of his bag. He went through it slowly, trying to understand the confusing academic writing. But ultimately, the book wasn't much help. For a while, there didn't seem to be any in it that resembled the code in the enigmatic manuscript. Finally, in a chapter called The Science of the Secret Message, he came across a symbol similar to the one written on the first page of the book. The symbol was called pi. Okay, so it was pi. I was right last chapter. Memories of Mrs. Benson's math class came back to Eddie. He already knew pi was a Greek letter that stood for 3.14, which, if you put it in a mirror, spells pi. Still, he tried to read more about it. The letter represented a constant relationship between the circumference and diameter of a circle, but he didn't see what it had to do with anything. Just before dinner, Eddie's father finally managed to set up the internet connection. Thinking about what the tow truck driver had said, Eddie searched for a link between the names Jeremy and Gatesweed. Near the top of the page, he found what he was looking for, a headline for an archived article in a journal called The Black Hood Herald. The article described an investigation which had occurred almost 20 years earlier into the disappearance of a 12-year-old boy from his bedroom one October night. His name had been Jeremy Quackerly. This must be the boy Sam had been talking about, Eddie thought. His childhood friend had disappeared. How horrible. But what did this have to do with the supposed Olmsted curse? The article didn't mention anything about curses. Next, Eddie searched for the words Olmsted curse. He received several results, but one paragraph leapt clearly off the screen. It was from a website called Cassandra's Calendar, posted several years ago. Some citizens of Gatesweed are calling these incidents the unfortunate consequence of the aptly named Olmsted curse. Local superstitions say the author's stories have wreaked havoc on the town itself. As strange as it may seem, many blame the missing author himself for the recent closing of the Black Ribbon Mill. Representatives for Mr. Olmsted pass off such comments as unsubstantial hogwash. Outside of Gatesweed, such hogwash continues to work wonders for the author's sales. Weird, thought Eddie. He read through several more search results. From the articles, Eddie gathered that for some reason people in Gatesweed believed Nathaniel Olmsted's stories were dangerous. Eddie didn't understand. How could words be dangerous? More important, Eddie still wasn't sure if there was a connection between the supposed curse and the book his mother had found in the barn. Certainly, the biggest clue of the day had been the bookstore. Now, at least, Eddie knew where the book had come from. He wondered if the blond boy who smelled like bug spray would be at school tomorrow. It was possible that they might even be in the same classes. If he could get up the nerve, Eddie would have another chance to ask for his help. As he went downstairs for dinner, he decided that's what he would do. And that is the end of Chapter 4. How many of you are asleep and how many are awake? Oh. That was a long chapter. Oh dang, it was a 40-minute long chapter. Whew. Well, Instead of keeping you all up, I think I'll let you all sleep. Hope you had a good listen, and have a good night.